Greetings everyone, I'm Kristian and welcome back to this week's edition of Lessons from Laurentian. In the first Lessons from Laurentian, Jim talked about phenology. In the second Lessons from Laurentian, Bobby talked about some of the mammals in Minnesota. Then we had the whole staff together for an Earth Day special edition. Last week, Sam talked about composting and food waste. This week, I'm going to be talking about fire ecology. So let's get started. When I first met you, I said that one of my favorite classes to teach up at Laurentian Environmental Center is the fire ecology class. And I really like that fire ecology class because it ties in two concepts, the concepts of fire and the concepts of ecology, and putting those two things together. So if we just take a second and think about it, fires we know are things that are burning. And ecology means the study of the home. So if we put those two things together, the home of things that are burning? Well, that doesn't make much sense. But what fire ecology is the study of the things that the animals and plants that need fire in order for them to have a home. So there's certain animals and plants that are dependent on the fire to come through on occasion in a wildland or forest setting. In northern Minnesota here we have red pine trees and white pine trees, like the ones you can see behind me. And these tree species actually like the occasional low intensity fire to come through their forest where they live. As you can see around me, there isn't a lot of brush, not a lot of the hazel. The hazel and the other small plants that would be on the forest floor are competing with these pine trees for nutrients. A low intensity fire that comes through here reduces that competition and allows the pines, as you can see there's a lot of them, to grow up bigger and faster and stronger because they don't have that competition. In the western parts of Minnesota, like the prairie regions, oaks would replace the pines. And the oaks are a tree species that is also fire tolerant. They're a species that likes having an occasional fire to remove the competition and keep them healthy. Also in the prairies, you'll notice that if you go out there and visit, that there's a lot of areas with grass. And those grass areas burned on a somewhat frequent basis, where a fire would come across the prairie and it would burn until it hit where the oaks were growing. And the oaks would be growing in areas where the soils were wetter and they weren't having the same aspect, the same slope. So the soils were wetter, and because of that, the intensity of that fire slowed down and didn't burn the entire forest. Forest fires are nature's way of kind of setting the clock back. So if you look in front of me, the area in front of me right here is kind of a grassy area. And I'm on the edge of a field. And you can see that on the very edge we've got a few small little trees that are growing, and then as you look behind me the trees get bigger. What a forest fire does is a forest fire sets that succession stage back further. So plants and animals that like that early forest benefit from having a forest fire. A great example of a species that benefits from fire is the jackpine. It might seem kind of ironic that a tree would benefit from a forest fire, but jackpine cones are what are called serotinous, which means that it needs the heat from the fire to open the pine cones up. When a forest fire comes through, the heat from that fire will burn the trees, but it'll also provide enough heat that opens up those cones that are kind of sealed up right now. The heat that these cones start opening up at is about 120 degrees. When that pine cone opens up, as in a forest fire, the seeds from that pine cone are going to be able to fall on the ground. And the thing about being on the ground is after a forest fire, there aren't any other plants around to compete with. And the other thing about a forest fire, just like in my little fire here, is that there's all sorts of ash that's left on the ground. All that this tree needs to grow now is a little bit of rain, because it's in the full sunlight. And that is how the jackpine forest can regenerate itself. as you can see, by getting my pine cone real close to that heat, those pine cone, it's opened up a little bit, and those seeds will be able to come out. Hey guys, I don't know if you can see me or not, but I'm making my way through a bunch of really thick jackpine. And that chunk of woods that I just walked through, if you'd have been here about 12 years ago, you wouldn't have seen anything here. It would have all been burnt, as you can see by this charred tree right here. This is a place where a forest fire went through about a dozen years ago. And as a result, all of these jackpine trees grew up in the last 12 years, and that area behind me is so thick you can hardly make your way through it. Another thing that benefits from wildfires are all of these blueberries around me. Now, obviously the blueberries aren't ripe yet, but if you were to come back here in August, you'd see all of these blueberries on all of these blueberry bushes around here. Because they're another plant species that maybe you're more familiar with that benefit from a forest fire. Animals and plants aren't the only thing that live in the forest. People also live in the forest. And people living in the forest has an effect on how that wildfire is as to whether it's good or bad. A couple of examples of that. One of the recent wildfires that we've had here in Minnesota was the Ham Lake wildfire. And that wildfire burned up in northeastern Minnesota, and where it burned, people had homes, they had cabins, they had all sorts of property. That fire burned very intensely, and because of that, people who had their homes up there and had their cabins up there lost everything. Everything was burnt to the ground in that fire. That fire also burned quite a bit of the woods around it. In fact, it spread up into Canada. It became so big. Another fire, similar sized, was the Pagani Creek wildfire. This wildfire burned almost exclusively in the Boundary Waters Canary Wilderness. Because of that, people didn't have homes. They didn't have cabins. There weren't any roads. This fire had a great benefit for the wildlife in the area because it was able to provide habitat for things like the moose, which are a species of animal that likes that early succession forest. They like the young plants to eat, to browse upon. And as opposed to the Ham Lake fire, where people's homes got burned, in the Pagani Creek fire, there weren't any homes. So it was a great benefit to the moose. Now, with the Ham Lake fire, even though a lot of people lost their homes, I was actually up there on that fire. I was sent up there as part of a fire crew to help with that fire. And I noticed that in that fire, there were some areas where the fire burned so hot that it burned down to the bedrock, and the rocks actually fractured because of the heat. Other areas just had a few standing trees, and other areas weren't even touched by the fire. When a wildfire burns, it doesn't burn evenly across the whole area. It burns in a patchwork, and that patchwork of spots burning here or there are what allows the wildlife and the forest to benefit from having those occasional fires. Well, I hope you learned a little bit more about fire ecology in this week's Lessons from Laurentian. So the answer is it depends on where that fire is. If the fire burns where humans aren't adversely affected, meaning people aren't harmed or properties lost, they can be really beneficial to nature. And in fact, some species really need a fire from time to time, like the blueberries and the jackpine that I showed you, or mammals like moose that eat the young forest that grows up after a fire. That brings us to our Ask the Naturalist question for this week, which comes from Jane. Jane asked about controlled burns. Controlled burns are fires that are set on purpose for a specific management objective. That objective varies from place to place based on a specific prescription. Just like when you go to the doctor to keep you healthy, you may get a different prescription from someone else who goes to the doctor. There's a lot of planning that goes into prescribed fire, and some of these fires are made for the benefit of trees to make the forest a healthier place and the timber more productive. Others are done for the benefit of wildlife. There are a lot of different tactics and strategies that go into safely having a prescribed or controlled burn and have a safe outcome that's both beneficial to people and nature. Thanks for listening and tuning in to this week's Lessons from the Laurentian on Fire Ecology.